Hi there. Welcome, everyone. I'm Amanda McCulloch, Executive Director for the Data Visualization Society, here with Rahul Bhargava to talk about his new book, Community Data. We're excited to have you joining us live or watching from wherever you are in the world to dive into the world of community data and data literacy. Let's get started. So Rahul, welcome to our author chat today to go ahead and have a conversation about community data. I'm so excited to have you here. For those who don't know the Data Visualization Society, I'll say a quick hello that DVS is the professional association for anyone doing data visualization across tech stacks, fields, even people who are data viz adjacent or data viz curious. We always welcome having you spend time with us at the Data Viz Society. And as part of what we do and in nurturing our community and celebrating and advancing the field, we love having conversations and showcasing new books that come out in our field to talk about different kind of themes and ideas in data viz, not just how to do it, but how we think differently about the world of how we engage with data. So excited to welcome our author here today. Would love to have you give a quick intro to yourself. What is community data and who is it for?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I've sort of enjoyed a number of different DVS events and super excited to chat about the book. Um, my name is Rahul Bhargava. I am a data storyteller in a lot of different ways. Right now, I'm a professor at Northeastern University in journalism and art design. So my background is in computer engineering, computer science. So like a lot of people in data visualization, I kind of live at intersections of fields. And for the last 15, maybe 20 years, I've been doing data literacy, data storytelling, data and community work all over the globe and with a variety of different types of groups. And I just got to the point where I was kind of frustrated with the sort of normal type of conversation around like, oh, let's make this cool infographic, or oh, let's put this bar chart. And I was like, okay, I'm going to work on this in a lot of different ways. And that's led to things like data murals, data sculptures, data theater now work that we're doing, sonification work that I'm working on. And I realized that I wanted to sort of package that argument in a way that felt appropriate for an academic and would try to be something that a lot of people could read. So it led to this book, which is this book, um, which is great to have in print now. It's awesome to have a physical thing in our digital world, which we'll connect to later in the chat, I think. And it's targeted at designers, journalists, community organizations, nonprofits, librarians, museum designers, people that are working with data sort of at the forefront with public in some way. So whether it's in civic settings, government meetings, or arts projects, or data design, data visualization designers. It's a big group I'm trying to speak to say, hey, you can do more. Your toolbox isn't this big, it's this big.
As I was reading through the book, and I appreciate getting a chance to read through it before we had a chance to connect today, it seemed like this mashup of a lot of my worlds coming together. Since my background's in public health, I've done a lot of work in East Africa where you have different stories and anecdotes from. And so for me, one of the things I really loved was the ways in which you celebrated examples and you celebrated work, not just from kind of who we traditionally think of as the data viz practitioners and who the data viz thought leaders are. Can you speak a bit about how you kind of connected with people who are doing this kind of work through your own practice or as part of the book writing?
Yeah, I think that's one of my goals, is to say, hey, look, we have a bunch of really compelling examples that a lot of us know well, the Menard, the Nightingale, but that canonical set really has come from only one discipline or one point of view. A lot of it's from like Tufte's work to sort of formalize one version of data visualization. And there are alternate examples that we can look to build a bigger toolbox and learn from. And I think that's especially important to do globally because the examples we have right now are mostly European and mostly male. And I think that's doing a disservice to the space of possibility and the creativity that we can look for. And I think there's more and more people like me now that are trying to like put out different histories, right? Alternative histories. Certainly Lauren Klein's latest book is doing that. So I was trying to look at all the examples that I found inspirational and pull from those things that I think counted as data visualization, even though you might not think a mini golf course about housing rights in LA counts. And like, actually, that counts. And it's very effective in a number of ways. Um, and trying to say, hey, look, the work that you all are doing that people are being more creative about, like it counts, it should be highlighted, it should be amplified because it
Mhm.
connects people more effectively than say like looking at a bar chart, at a community event.
Funny because a big part of why DVS exists is because of conversations coming out of the Tapestry conference where we said, why isn't there a space for more people across domains and across spaces to connect with each other? And you and I originally connected, I mean, back in the day, two years ago now, connected at the Viz in Science and Education Gordon Research Conference, which as I was looking through photos, it was a bit comical because some of them were of like the lobster night they had at the cafeteria. For anyone who hasn't attended a GRC, which I assume is most of the world because I had never heard of these before Jen Fraser introduced me to the idea, they have been around for decades. They are places for people to share scientific papers and research before publication for feedback and ideas, and to gather people who have a very specific niche kind of interest area or field. And at this event, Rahul was one of the speakers. So you did a great talk talking about data culture at the event, and it is just a comical week. Everyone stays in dorms together and eats in the cafeteria together. It's quite the immersive experience. There is one coming up this summer, so if you're curious about these kind of intersectional spaces, or sorry, December of 2025. If you're curious about these kind of intersectional spaces, it was a great space to get to hear from people like you, but then also people doing like amazing, huge, massive satellite level visualizations at NASA. And so these kind of created spaces that let us talk to people who we might not otherwise meet and have those creative collisions, I think are so valuable. And prepping for this talk, it was interesting just thinking back to where we've connected before with the GRC originally, and then bringing you to Baltimore to do the closing keynote for our IIB Information is Beautiful Awards Day of Inspiration talks, where you talked about questioning our data culture. And we're putting out some big kind of chewy things for people to grapple with, especially if they haven't dug into some of the alternate histories, perhaps, of the data visualization world. And so, as we were talking and kind of looking back at what that talk looked like, I felt like some of the principles and ideas and examples that you were able to tease out there were things that came out in the book as well. So, if anyone's trying to decide if community data is a book for you, I think watch the talk from the IIB mini conf that we had last year. I'll put a link in the chat, and because it's a great kind of primer on some of these similar concepts. And you'll see that some of the people who he actually met at the event ended up making their way into the book. So can you talk a bit about that process of kind of connecting with folks and what that looks like?
Yeah, I think that was wonderful, just the chatting and the connecting at that event. And Dorsey Kaufman, as you're highlighting here, we ended up having a long chat about alternate approaches to data visualization and studying them, right? Trying to make not only the sort of demonstrative, but also the like quantitative assessment of whether an arts piece of data and a like printed PDF, you know, what the different impacts are. And she and the broader team that she was working on the Ripple Effect project had done that in really interesting ways. And we ended up chatting later. And I was like, wait a minute, this would be an amazing case study for the book. So thank you again for inviting me. And Ripple Effect is one of the projects I feature in there, which you should definitely read about. It's an example of bridging across traditional formal approaches to sharing data in community participatory projects and arts-based approaches to representing things.
When I think about Dorsey's work and I think about Ripple Effect and some of the other examples, I mean, I think the big kind of cloud hanging over the world of these offline forms of data experiences almost is this question about how community data interfaces in a really AI enthusiastic world that we have today. And thinking about that on a couple levels, like both from the perspective of what's the role of this kind of work when we're driving ourselves more and more to asking questions of LLMs to help us answer and surface knowledge. And then what makes its way back into those systems? How do we make sure that we don't erase the history that we had of doing this kind of work now, the way that that happened in the past, because people weren't the ones writing the history books. So if people like me are really a little bit AI skeptical, I'm concerned about ethics and about climate issues and things like that. If I'm not sitting there having conversations and feeding my questions into that knowledge base, and that happens on a larger scale, I mean, what does that look like in the long term? What's the role of community data in an AI enabled world?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to pull apart there. So
I
I,
know.
I think one of my mentor, Ethan Zuckerman, wrote a great piece for The Atlantic a while back about like in the analogy to the Industrial Revolution and how like the a lot of jobs were created to sort of maintain and keep the mechanical apparatus moving, right? So like there are a lot of jobs to like feed and curate and sort of sustain large language models. Like
Mhm.
but like that's not a good vision of what humanity is. That's not where we're adding value. So I really don't think it's like I really don't I would frame it a little bit differently, I'd say, right? So these large language models, like they can be helpful for brainstorming things, right? And when I put in a question yesterday about, hey, I'm presenting some recycling data from my city in a community setting. Give me some creative approaches to presenting it. And like number 14 on the list was actually make a data physicalization,
Mm.
which is like pretty low down compared to all the other dumb ideas that would not work at all. Um, so I think that knowledge representation is important. Um, and like helping people ask better questions is the bigger issue, right? Because
Mm.
like I framed the question as help me present it in a creative way, which led to a response, right? So like knowing that the toolbox were typically shown in a digital tool like bar charts and line charts and like scatter plots and that stuff, this is not the right toolbox to start with for community settings where the goals are things like engagement, participation, empowerment, justice, right? Like efficacy. Those goals are different than the domains where the charts we use came to maturity, right? Statistics, maybe like business process, in those domains, computer science, in those domains, those are not the goals. It's not that they're bad, it's just a misalignment. So knowing that you're in a setting where those charting tools were not built for the setting you're in,
Mm.
that's the important thing to know to ask the question. And that's what I'm trying to push on is be like, okay, here's my audience, here's my goals. What is the way to share this data story?
It's funny. I had this hypothesis that one of the benefits we might see from using these kind of chat-based tools is people being able to frame and ask better questions. And do you think that will happen just by practice? I mean, I got better at Google searching as
Yeah,
I did more Google searching, right? I came up as an elder millennial. I refined my approach to Google searching. I'm a way better Google searcher than my mother is, for example, and I love her to bits. But there was just a certain amount of practice. No one ever said, here's the specific framework for how you must write Google searches. Do you
yeah.
feel like with the ways people are engaging with and using these AI enablement approaches, that we'll see that similar trend towards people maybe learning to ask better questions and frame them more specifically?
I mean, I appreciate the optimism of that thought, right?
I've been
But like,
looking for
I think,
some good. I've been looking for some
yeah,
good. Like, how
there's
can this help?
larger there's larger trend here, right? We have been learning to speak to computers for a long time. Your Google example is great. People talk to their Alexa in a different voice than they talk to other people. People talk like I have Siri
Mm,
voice I use when I'm trying to get Siri to do what I want, right? Like we have been learning, we are being taught how to talk to computers. And your example of talking to like a chatbot is very similar, right? People are definitely going to learn how to talk to the chatbot, but I don't think that means they're going to learn to ask better questions. Like, I don't think because these are narrowing tools, right? Like these tools push us towards a dominant way and a singular like collapsed way of ideating, which
mhm.
is fine. Like I have my students use these chatbots to come up with ideas, and I say, look, these are like your crappy first round of ideas in a brainstorm, right? It's not going to give you the good ideas, but like those crappy first ideas are good. So I don't share that optimism. I think that the optimism I have is that the idea of brainstorming and like coming
Mhm.
up with lots of ideas and evaluating them, maybe that muscle will get better because
Mhm.
there's so many ideas you can generate with a generative AI model. They're not great ones, maybe they'll get better, but like just the idea that you can do that and that you should think about something more before you do the first idea, maybe that'll get better.
Yeah, I think my optimism comes a little bit from the fact that you have this blend of practice and the structures of prompting, right? And I see more and more of the kind of prompt structures people are volunteering as think like a, and how do I put myself in the shoes of someone else, or ask someone to ask a tool to think like a persona or in someone else's mindset. And maybe that's where part of my optimism comes from, is from this framing around better responses come from typically narrowing the field and saying, I want you to think like a blank and do this thing like a blank or for a blank kind of audience. And we talk about that a ton in data biz, right? And you talk about
Yeah,
community data.
yeah,
How
yeah.
do you think first about who it is you're engaging with? And so if we start setting up this mental model that we have, that we start from a place of identifying who that is and then asking the question, maybe that's where my optimism stems from.
Yeah, I like that. And I think it speaks to wrestling back like data storytelling from the domains of stats and computer science, right? Because they're interested in very specific types of questions that
Mhm.
are not as connected to real community settings, right? Like it's great to look at how people like how important a title is in a chart to understand, what recall is in terms of what people take away. But like that is totally devoid of any context setting about what the story is and who the audience is and what the
Mhm.
goals of sharing that story are. And I find that very like we need to wrestle that back. Be like, yeah, that's great, but like that isn't the only set of questions to ask. I get that those are formalized and useful, but like the key question, as you said it, is who is the audience? What are their capacities for understanding data? And maybe I'm better off painting a data mural as a way to get people engaged with some artists and some local youth than making a bar chart and getting people around a table to talk about it.
Well, I think your point about kind of who the creators are makes me think of some of the work Crystal Lee did around the pandemic and around issues of misinformation, and how understanding and knowing who the people are who are creating the charts and graphs, and maybe at a huge scale, building and making the data mural. You have an example from, I think it was
Yeah,
from Kenya, where you worked with local graffiti artists to actually be the ones who are kind of doing the design work and putting things in practice. Um, I think Crystal's work, when she studied and they looked at anti-mask sentiment and the use of data viz around how that moved around, one of the findings that I always go back to, and I've shown in a lot of talks I've done, is people trusted the data visualizations more when they knew who the human was who made it, rather than it being kind of the
yeah,
amorphous from Pew Research Center, but instead saying
yeah,
who the name of the person is that I can go look them up. As
yeah.
you think about the role of that kind of who the creator is and that level of trust, how do you feel like that plays out in these larger community
Yeah.
installations?
No, I love Crystal's work. I think I'll actually be there talking with them, talking with their group at MIT in March, I think, or February. And that one of the things about that paper was like, what was the motivation for using charts and graphs on social media to talk about COVID? It was because they carry a power and rhetorical power of truth, right? They look right, and they look trustable, and that's interesting because what there's all this interesting research in psychology that says when you see things like that that look formal and true, you are less likely to engage and ask questions, right? So in community settings where your goal is to get people to engage and ask questions, I argue that less formal representations of data are more effective. So
Mm.
that's the first piece is like that rhetorical power can actually silence people because they're like, oh, that chart, it's a chart with a lot of decimal points, uh, and that's
Very
actually
charty,
like
very science,
yeah,
very real, very objective,
it
right?
silences people. And if you're trying to like convince a boardroom, by all means, you want them to be quiet and agree with you. But if you're in a community setting, like at a civic meeting or at a library, like that's not your goal. So I think for the second piece of your point, the about who's creating, one of the chapters in here is called "Build Mirrors, Not Windows." And it's a metaphor I've found very helpful to think about who gets to work with data and why. And most of our data practices are kind of like looking at someone through a window, right? And like you're seeing some other phenomenon, grabbing data, analyzing it, and then maybe showing it back to them. But like you can't see everything through a window. And it really others the group that the data is about. So I argue that in community settings, we more often want a mirror so that the people that are working with the data are in fact the people that are represented in the data themselves. Um, and yes, that gets messy, but it's a productive messy, right? It's
Mhm.
useful friction. Um, and it's empowering, which is one of the goals of these spaces. It's fun, which is a goal of a lot of my work and should be like a goal of more work, I think, like fun and joy in a very Nigel Holmes kind of way, right? I think the joyful infographic, what's the title of his recent of that
Joyful,
book?
joyful infographics. That's his book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like very much in that kind of way. Like that should be a design goal. So it's definitely more fun. So I tend to think about like that metaphor of building mirrors. It drives a lot of my work. Um,
Mhm.
and it's about putting the data in the hands of the people that are actually the subjects of the data.
No, I love that you brought that up because Neil actually said and made the point that when he read the preview in Alberto's newsletter of your book a few months ago, one of the things that fascinated me was the window versus mirror metaphor.
Oh,
And
great.
for me, it makes me think a lot of how you create better feedback loops. Like a mirror has an implicit kind of feedback loop that what I see is kind of I see myself in it and I see myself in the information. And the window piece for me extended out to oftentimes our aim is to look out the window, but not allow anyone to look back in. And when we think about the ways back in my earlier days of being a monitoring and evaluation professional in public health, a lot of conversations were happening. This is back in like 2010 about the challenges with the extractive ways in which we gather data. We want to go assess the impact of our programs. And while maybe we have folks who are benefiting from the programs, often framed as beneficiaries, which is a little bit, you know, condescending in language as it is. But as you think about who those people are, will often go take their time to answer these long surveys, asking a lot of questions. And then the results of that survey that indicate how successful our program was to our funder are things that go back. I mean, they kind of go into big reports, maybe a dashboard, maybe it's a presentation at a big conference, but they're not oftentimes or weren't oftentimes going back to the communities where people were working. And what I loved about some of your critique, I think, of that system, because you talk about the challenges in international development and the issues with that approach to data, is opening up a bigger conversation about kind of the colonial history of how we kind of collect and use data more broadly, which I think is a big theme we're starting to see more people have conversations about in a necessary way. And I'm
We
curious if you
don't
maybe speak a little bit to those themes, because I think they're really important, especially in kind of where we are today in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I try to give practical examples, the things people can do in the book to sort of fight against those or
Mhm.
work like alongside those when they're structured. I think it speaks a little bit to like the hidden histories that we don't talk about. And Alberto Cairo talked about this, just to pull on that thread, in the keynote for the IEEE Viz for Social Good, I think, workshop, which you all should go watch. It's a great talk. Talking about like the discordant time we're in data storytelling and challenging of norms. And one of the things he highlights, which I totally agree with, is we don't talk about the history of some of these like of these mechanisms that are celebrated, right? We don't talk about how all of our all of our statistical methods came from the eugenicists, right? Like that's the context where these methods came from um, in the 1920s, and that's really troubling, right? It should be really troubling, and we
Mhm.
should recognize it to say, hey, look, are the methods I'm using are they embedding some colonial thinking or extractive or disempowering ways of acting? And yes, it's kind of academic to ask the question that way, but like it's a really important question to think about power and in this case I mean like the ability of some group of people to impact their conditions in the world. Like what is your power and agency? And this our data work has a lot to do with that. And I think we have to wrestle with some of the histories that we don't like talking about to be able to do that more powerfully.
One of the things that kind of creates power is sometimes the ability to talk about and define things. So define words and phrases. And you spend time in your book talking about semantics to a certain degree on how we define and what data literacy is and what those shared definitions of what data is, data are, in terms of looking at the plural of singular. As you think about the role that language plays in that and semantics play, is there a connection there with the power piece for you?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I like I mentioned, I'm a professor in journalism here, so I do a lot on language and narrative framing, right? Like the words imply a way of thinking about things. So that definitely comes up in the book. I also try not to get lost in sort of pedantic arguments about pluralizations or like or terminology. I think that it starts with the word data, you know? Most people think of numbers, and we have this whole other world of like images and voice and quotes and like all these other forms of information that are captured. that for some reason we don't count as data right now, which seems
Mm,
like a real oversight and a missed opportunity. So like it starts with that if we can push, it's important to talk about definitions because if we can push on them a little bit, it helps us come up with better ideas, I think, and more engaging and inclusive ideas rather than sort of putting on blinders with some of the ways we think. So, with literacy, for example, one of the first papers that I wrote with Catherine Dignazio, we work together all the time, was
can I
included
just say I'm
a
jealous that you get to work with Catherine all the time? She's one of those people I look at, I'm like, "You're just incredible." All the things you write, just incredible.
the work is
And
great. The Data Feminism Lab at MIT is doing amazing work, and we met when she was in her grad program. We've been able to just sync up and work since then, and it's been a real joy learning from her work. And definitely, there's overlaps with data feminism in this book, like definite overlaps. And I see a lot of my work as examples of applied practices for data feminism. The I think the one of our first papers together includes a definition of data literacy that highlights the sort of last piece for us, which is about using data to make an argument in context. And at the time, this is like 15 years ago, not a lot of people were focusing on the application of data, like either making charts or data analysis or anything of that in a context. They were talking about like the ability to make charts, the ability to analyze data. They weren't talking about the ability to put it into practice. Luckily, that's become normalized now to be included in data literacy definitions. But like, it was really fascinating to see that progress because it wasn't there. When we started doing this work, that was not a normal part of the definition, the application of data in a context for some purpose, which I think more of us
interesting.
care about, especially in, as I argue, in means community settings.
As you think about what that looks like and how that actually plays out in practice, I feel like we've had a lot more conversations in the past, I mean, 5 years with COVID and everything else, but Alberto especially has been pushing on this idea that there isn't one set of rules we all have to follow, and instead thinking about how do you make choices that are justifiable ethically and based on kind of what your goals are in terms of what you're building and the constraints you're working in. I mean, I think the data viz community can be one that is hugely welcoming, and I'm so grateful for the many ways in which I think we're often community taught in this field in terms of learning from others. It also is a space where if you put your work out for public consumption, people are very willing to nitpick all the teeny tiny little things that they would have done differently without necessarily knowing the context of like what were the constraints, what were the timing constraints, did you have to do this in 3 days to get this chart up or this interactive graphic up. And I'm curious how this idea of thinking about context should extend into how we practice and create data visualizations. Because it's one thing to bring the ideas and the practices of visualizing and communicating data into a community, but what are our responsibilities as data visualization creators to not lose sight of that context piece?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people doing good work on that question now, which I sort of
Mhm.
learn a lot from. I think at a high level, I think that the when people used to ask, or when most people sort of ask, "Oh, how do I learn data visualization? Like, what skills do I need to acquire?" You hear about things like, "Oh, you know, get started with D3," or like, "Make sure you're in Excel," or like, "Get your Tableau skills honed up." And those are all technical competencies. And
Mm,
I think that's a poor response. Like, we're doing a disservice if we just talk about technical competencies because it doesn't say anything about responsibility. And that's why I say, like, we need to claw this back from computer science because I was trained in computer science. I have lovely friends in computer science. Computer science does a really bad job of teaching people how to do ethical application of computational skills, right? Like, I don't
mm,
think I need to give more examples. Look at the world around us, right? Like, I don't think I need to name any examples. Like, that's just not. There's great people doing solid examples, but it's not the norm. So, like, what can you look to? Where can you learn from about application in data visualization and ethics and norms? I think it's design and like participatory design is a field that I look to. Look, they've done a lot of work in a lot of settings around how to engage people in ethical ways, and that type of thinking can be really valuable. So I would say, if you're learning this stuff now and you want to apply data to like create impact in communities in some way, you got to study participatory design. That's what you really need to learn. It's like, yeah, like you need to analyze data and stuff like that, but like honestly, especially with all the AI stuff that you talked about, like that's not the particularly hard part. and it's
Hmm.
getting easier and it's getting more democratized. But designing how to introduce it, how to show it, how to invite people to engage with it, that's activity design. And that's why the book talks about examples from museums and libraries and newsrooms because they have skills in those fields. And that's where I would look to learn how to do this work ethically.
Tell me that you also have like a tag in your photos account wherever you keep your photos of museum vids, because I definitely take photos whenever, especially as someone who has small children.
There's so
Whenever at
much.
museums, I'm like, these are so great, these are so interesting, and occasionally I'm like, what were they thinking? This doesn't make
Well,
sense,
and
but
it's so tactile, right? Because like
yeah.
sensory museums are sensory. So in my chapter that talks about like the words I use are like sonification, edibilization, um, uh, I talk about tangible, I talk so in the smellification, in that chapter, there's tons of museum examples because museums try to engage the senses. And in data visualization, we've prioritized the visual over all our other senses. And that's just
Mhm.
not how we experience the world, right? So I talk about the power in those senses. So if you want to play in that space, museums, we have so much to learn from their practices. They're just doing every day with like thousands of people visiting and like talk about iteration. Right? I mean, there's so many inspirations, both simple and complex in that world. And I've taught, I teach like an educational museum exhibit design course here at Northeastern to our PhD students in the College of Arts and Media. And it's so fun because I do it data centered and they do
Mm.
amazing work. It's really cool stuff because that way of thinking about your senses overall can just again, open up that toolbox and
So
just
you
blow it
said
up.
the word edibilization, which I'm just going to say when it comes to things we have submitted, for like the IIB awards, having someone ship us a bunch of salty brownies is not what normally happens. But I do find it fascinating because you've gone beyond the kind of sonification things that we talked about a lot and the physical touch aspects and talked about that in the book. And just because I found it delightful, can you please talk about the salty brownies?
Yeah, sure. So most people know the data cuisine work in if you look at like edible food and data, and it's great work. And I think one of the two organizers is from the museum space, if I remember right, as a curator.
Mm,
The the And much of that work still focuses on visual. We did an analysis of a sample
mm,
of their public projects. I had a student go through and like mark out like what techniques are each of these using? Are they using flavor encodings? Are they using visual encodings? Are they using taste? And like very few of them used taste as a primary vehicle for encoding. So
mm.
I was like, "Oh, we're still stuck in this, like, other way of thinking of visuals, even when we're using other materials." So, in one of my classes, I had students do an edibilization project. They had to tell a story with food about data, and the particular example that sticks in my mind was ended up with me eating the saltiest brownie I've ever ate, uh, and it was terrible, was students very simply encoded, um, they made brownies and they encoded, air quality data, onto the amount of salt in the brownie. So you eat the, like, WHO standard brownie and you're like, "This is a really good brownie." It's delicious, glass of milk, it's amazing. And then you eat I think it was, like, LA on its worst day at the time, and you're like, "Oh,
Mhm.
like, I like salty sweet, but this is too much. Like, just no." And then you go eat I don't forget if it was New Delhi or Beijing, I forget.
I think it
Um,
was. I thought it was Delhi, if I'm remembering right.
yeah, so then you go take a bite of that brownie and it's like the saltiest thing you've ever eaten. And the key is, like, I did not forget that, right? And, like, it's funny, it tells a good story, but, like, that was probably 10 years ago, and I've not forgotten that, like, even now, I'm gonna take a sip of my water.
You can taste it still
So
lingering there, right?
memorable.
Yeah.
It's so memorable, and, like, there was another one where journalism students made this fun video of, like, smoothies they did, where the amount of kale mapped on was encoding the amount of, carbon emissions in different countries, and they're
Mhm.
eating, and it wasn't per capita, so they get to China, and they, like, take the smoothie, and they're like you can see them, they're like, "This is the worst thing ever. That is a terrible smoothie," you know? It's really memorable.
The bitterest smoothie you've probably ever
Yeah,
drunk. It's just packed with
yeah.
kale.
I think edibilization, like some of these multisensory techniques, the remembering like that sensory experience, and I talk
Mhm.
about different ways of knowing information in the book. I go into a little bit of the like ways we think about how we know information, which can get a little academic, but like very often we prioritize abstract scientific ways of knowing. And those are charts and graphs, things like that are propositional or abstracted.
Mhm.
Um, but like, so we have lots of other ways of knowing, right? Like I play soccer and my muscles know things about kicking a ball poorly, but still, a lot like they know it in a different way. I didn't learn soccer by like abstract charts and graphs. I learned it by playing it. And that's a body-based knowledge. That's very different. And the sensory experience of eating that brownie is very different. So if you want to impact people, like I have not forgotten that brownie. Mm-mm.
I think what one of the things I'm curious about with some of these more novel ways of engaging with information is part of it the novelty and uniqueness. Like if you ate a different kind of salty brownie every single week from a class or from whatever else or in every museum exhibit, would it suddenly become less memorable? Kind of thinking to the parallel of we see so many bar charts and so now we don't pay as much attention to them perhaps as being something engaging and interesting.
That's interesting. It connects. It's a really good question. It connects to two things that I think are worth mentioning. The first is going back to Dorsey's work, right? They created a this water ripple physical representation of this water pollution data that was like art space, sonic, visual, lots of stuff going on. And then they compared it to the PDF report, which people also got. So it was really and they compared it to getting both. So if you go look at the studies on ripple effect that they wrote up, like one of the things is that people when they had both were doing a lot of sense making, and were more likely to, with some proxies they were looking at, more likely to act later. Yeah, this is great. So that's the water ripple that would bounce and jump. And in their study where they looked at the results, they looked at both together. So I actually advocate for multiple layers of this stuff. And that's one of the chapters in here is about multiple layers of reading. The first, like, oh, that salty brownie's terrible. But then I want to know more. So give me something that's in more detail that helps me learn more. And museums are great at this because you have to design an exhibit for 5 seconds or 20 minutes. So
Mhm.
another thing we can learn from that museum exhibit design. The second point I wanted to add there, well, sorry, no, go ahead.
No, please.
The second point that I was going to add there is the oh, I forgot what it was. Darn, I got all carried away with Dorsey's work.
It is really interesting, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah, I
so
forgot what it was.
you'll come back to this second, I'm sure.
Okay.
And when you do, just raise your finger and say, I've figured it out. Uh, when I see Dorsey's work and I see, which had like, I think NSF funding behind it in terms of funding. And when I see the work that other large museums are doing, and you talk about kind of being able to iterate, there's also a certain amount of cost that comes with putting these big installations in place. I think about the NASA Earth Information Center that was at NASA headquarters near my house in DC. And they had a 20-foot long high resolution screen that they have amazing work on. You should absolutely go if you're a data nerd and you live
Mhm.
in DC or you visit the city. Go spend an hour over at NASA headquarters. It's lovely. But these are not small dollar figure projects. And so I'm curious, and you've worked in low resource settings. How do we pivot away from thinking that to do this, we have to do it so well that it could be in a museum? Because I think that's the barrier to a lot of folks to doing this kind of work. Similar to putting your data viz out in public. I see the work other people are doing, and I feel intimidated and imposter syndrome about what I'm creating and that it's not good enough to share with the world. When in all actuality, I mean, I love seeing work from people who are kind of iterating and learning. But museum exhibits are expensive. The Amazon Data Science Alley at the National Children's Museum is not cheap, but it's really cool. But it's not inexpensive to make. So how do we make this more accessible to people who are curious about experimenting with these methods in ways that are doable in various different settings and with various different resourcing levels?
Yeah, that's a good reality reminder. I think, yes, and there's a spectrum of options, right? There's a lot between like me making making a data viz out of some of my Lego minifigs that I have here, and like the gallery with like a $500,000 budget putting together an exhibit. There's a lot of space between those two things, and that space is part of where I situate my work. So look at the data murals, right? It is very easy to get an artist and a set of people to design and paint a mural together, right? The costs are relatively low, especially if someone's donating the wall. right? Like paint's cheap, you pay an artist for like a day of work. Um, these are low cost things. The Similarly with the data sculptures, we use a lot of like I made this whole with my wife, we made this whole data sculpture that's a table made out of recycled cutlery, right? So like you can do simple things, and a lot of those museums that you pointed out, the first thing you see is some kind of physical pole, right? Where you're getting like 3 jars and pom poms, and each jar is an answer, and you put your pom pom in the jar that is the answer you agree with,
Mhm.
right? So there are really cheap versions of participatory, tactile, physical, sensory experiences that can be made that don't require that level of budget. But I'll say this, like we've gotten used to like computers and printing and a projection, like those are all expensive too. So it depends what you're comparing it to, right? Like if you're comparing it to like someone having a computer and like making a data visualization, that's expensive. Like what's the average hourly rate of the people on this call, right? It's not $5 an hour. So that
Well,
training is
maybe
expensive.
maybe it's a scale question, right? And I think there's so much more access to public maker spaces these days than there ever were before, right? I mean, your I think your data sculpture is a great example of something I look at and I'm like, I don't know where I'd start doing that because I don't weld. So that would be barrier number one, right? But I do when I teach my class at Micah and teach data foundations. One of our assignments for the week is you have to make a visualization using physical objects and non-digital media. And now people submit them with pictures because of the fact that we all are in distributed places, but people use things like Scrabble tiles and Play-Doh and all those other kind of media that you can actually do at a small scale. And so I think one of the things I think is great is seeing more people. Like we have someone from LinkedIn who said, I've been focusing on having my students create creative charts alongside the basic ones. And I'm not sure if that extends to physical objects and mixed media, but having them come out with great ways of communicating data and at least normalizing that in a class, we're saying that this is also a valuable skill to learn, I think is really important for us to think about as teachers in terms of what we normalize as what the right practices are. Because no matter how many times you say, please go and do with this knowledge of encodings what you will, when someone's doing a master's program, they're trying to learn a form or structure for how they approach this kind of work. And so I feel like even in that seemingly small space, we even did, when I was working with USAID, we had a big global data workshop in Bangkok. Had folks from, I think, 30 different missions around the world flew in. And every day after lunch, we had data fun. And I got to lead data fun, and it was great. And we did data fun, and we did like make a little sculpture out of Play-Doh or do rapid chart
Yeah.
iterations on a board or something else like that. And just pulling people out of the norm of what they're normally building and the data that they're used to receiving and then visualizing, and instead
Yeah.
thinking about how they create the data themselves. To me, it kind of takes me over back to like Georgia Loopy's data humanism work in terms of small data and the Dear Data project work that she did with Steph Pasovak that focused on not just what the end product was, but the process. And I think that comes out a lot in your book too, around the value in that process and is part of that participatory design work that you were mentioning previously. But if someone's interested in digging into kind of focusing on process and talking about how you measure value, especially if you're accountable to a funder, what does that look like for you? Because you've had these big
Yeah.
projects and you've had
Yeah.
them funded by foundations and places that do ask you to justify the existence, right? And that can be
Yeah.
challenging in these larger design
It's
endeavors.
It's hard. That's real. It's a challenge to talk about the impact of this kind of work and the value of it in a language that is legible to funders or somebody that holds the purse strings. Um,
Mhm.
I tend to start on like returning to the goals, right? So if the number of like participation is a goal, then okay, I look at the number of people, I design more participatory processes. If they say impact is a goal, like that's just not helpful because like then you need like give me your logic model, give me something to work with
Mhm.
here. And
And I'm like, where's the
then you
theory of change of how your data
yeah.
sculpture has impacted and changed funding for people who are experiencing food insecurity? I mean, that's much more complex.
Yeah, so I tend to respond in those situations. That one was an interesting example because just responding to your earlier question about cost, like
Yeah.
one of the reasons that working with artists is great is that artists are incredibly good at doing things on the cheap. right? Like nobody is better than that, than artists at that, right? Like you give an artist $500, they will like change the world. It's incredible. And we need to learn from that if people that don't see themselves as artists but want to do this type of work, um, to work in sort of low resource situations. So, but coming back to this, like the the table was incredibly low cost because we used mostly recycled cutlery. We ended up buying like a little bit at the end. By the way, like all of the welding I did fell off. My wife is the welder in the family, so like the fork that fell off on the first time. But that first time the fork fell off, I tend to respond with narratives of impact, right? So I talk
Mhm.
about like, oh, the guy that helped us carry it to like an install in front of City Hall at a community farm asked what it was. We said, oh, it's this thing that like it's about food security and how you can get help. And he said, oh, can I sign up for that? And I said, yes, at that table right over there, right? So I tend to talk about stories of impact as a way to say, look, these are the type of outputs. We tried to get it at City Hall downtown to influence a discussion that was happening about subsidizing lunches across the state. So we're trying to like everyone knows that like arts have impact, but the justification is like a broader issue that is not unique to the things we're talking about here with data,
Mhm.
right? It's about like it's a problem for creative arts in general that often is asked this by non-arts funders or arts funders. What's your impact? Well, it's like, oh,
Mhm.
the experience and the emotions of these people that like came to see a data theater piece about greening in the city and gentrification, right? And then we have like a community dialogue afterwards, so we get some quotes to share. So it that stuff's real and it's hard, but using media, using quotes, using other forms of data, so
Mhm.
like practicing what you preach is often a good way to do that justification back to somebody that needs to like nod and agree and sign off on things.
Well, I mean,
And
those
hopefully like
and the
creating more
mixed
examples.
well, mixed methods is great, right? I mean, it gives you that kind of way of blending the quantitative and qualitative. In the book I'm working on, that's entirely different from yours in the sense that we're talking all about dashboards. One of the conversations we've been having is around kind of the when you measure success, kind of the big S, little s, almost as a corollary to the impact versus the outputs. Little s success is I can count how many people showed up on the page and looked at it. But if 1,000 people viewed the dashboard in the course of 6 months, but only one person who could actually make a meaningful change with the data didn't actually use it, that's like not hitting on that impact piece in terms of how the dashboard was used to change and reshape decisions.
Yeah.
But it's much harder to measure and count like how many different times did a dashboard get pulled up in a team meeting because it was able to
Yeah.
give someone the data point they want. You're not
Great
logging
point.
those routinely. I mean, we're bad at food journaling, let alone kind of logging decision influences. And so I
Yeah.
do think that thinking about that measurement piece, maybe this is just my roots as a researcher, but that measurement piece is so important because I think that when we start talking about goals, one of the questions that comes up is how do you measure progress towards those goals? And I love how you tied those things back together in terms of figuring out what those metrics are based on what someone wants to achieve. And I hope that funders will continue to see more value in this kind of work. I hope that elevating and uplifting this kind of work through things like industry awards helps to
Yeah.
celebrate the fact that these are remarkable and wonderful ways of engaging people with information. But
Yeah.
I don't know that the funders are the ones who are listening to and getting excited about watching the live stream for the IIB Awards.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and luckily, like you mentioned earlier, right, the idea of Alberto's dialects, right? Like we have broader movement to embrace more that to blow up that toolbox, right? I'm certainly not the only one making this argument that like we should do broader things and use a bigger toolbox. But there is a diversity of dialects emerging in data representation practices.
Mhm.
And that's great because sometimes you just need to point at some other group that's like, oh, they did it. So we should do it too. And that is enough to convince someone because people don't want to be left out. So I do think
Mhm.
one of our roles in like in a book or in events is to highlight that richness of examples to say not just to the creators who might already know it, this is okay, this counts, but to be able to give them something to point at, to say, look, all this stuff is happening, we can do it too.
Hmm.
So hopefully that hopefully that's one way people use the book.
I hope so. mean, I'm curious from your side as you think about the fact that, I mean, we're clearly here talking under the guise of being part of the Data Visualization Society. What is the role of community groups and organizations in helping to amplify and support adoption of these different principles and ideas that you put forward in community data?
I I think it's like it's kind of funny because they community groups I work with immediately get it. They're like, "Oh yeah, of course, we want to paint a mural of that. That makes total sense." They're like, "Yeah, we can do that. That's total." So part of it is that most of the things I share are learned from these settings. They're learned from the newsrooms, from the museums, from the community groups. It's from like I mentioned, I've been doing this stuff for 15 years, and I've tried to sort of like absorb some of those lessons while sharing some of my own approaches. So there's an exchange, right? Like again, in your boardroom, you want to do something like what Tufty says, but like on the street, you don't. You want to do something that is like, and that matters, right? It's like the example of the cardboard bar chart that I talk about, where this protest group created a cardboard stacked bar chart of the Chicago city budget to talk about defunding police. And
Mhm.
the, for me, the power of that, from sort of an outside observer, is that you can move the boxes, right? A stack of cardboard boxes can be picked up and moved, and that's not true of a bar and a bar chart, right? It's a unit. You can't change it. You can't make it shorter. It's like a fixed block. So like the materials, like those things are embedded in materials in a way that we lose when we sort of narrow on visualization in technical ways. And I think community, moving back to your question, community groups get that. They get that we need to use diverse resources to pull together what we can. So I
Mhm.
actually find like they don't need to do any unlearning. The people that need to unlearn are the people that have been trained in these formalized techniques, and they need to unlearn a little bit of that to be able to engage the context of
Mm.
what the story they're trying to tell is. And that's why it's fun to have them work together with community groups.
Absolutely. There's an interesting comment from someone who joined us on LinkedIn that she works for local government in Maryland around the need for more data storytelling, especially in public meetings, with the irony that council members love to
Yeah,
see numbers and charts. And I find this too, where people are like, I love data, I love
yeah,
visualization, I love graphics. And then you have them point to kind of what the graphics are that they're using to then communicate to broader audiences who don't necessarily have that inbuilt enthusiasm for looking at charts. And there's just this knowledge gap. How do we help people who are in those positions of influence and power to really
yeah,
kind of think more broadly? Because maybe they're not the ones picking up community data and reading it, even if they should.
yeah. I would go back to sort of a description of the ways we use data and why. I tend to talk about it in the three ways. The first is like the classic business intelligence or analytics, right? Like using data to measure some process and then make a change and measure it again, which is
Mhm.
often what civic government is doing about like maybe it's recycling rates, maybe it's something else. The second one I tend to talk about is using data to spread some message. So this is like I'm telling you a data story, infographics, things like that. The third, which I sort of highlight in the book most, is using data to bring people together. And I would argue for local government in Maryland, figure out like there may be different answers for different settings, right? So like the city councilor that wants to see the numbers on a chart, great. The numbers should be on a chart. But when you're at a community meeting talking about those numbers, maybe you need something different, you know?
Mm.
And this is where it's like, let's go back to recycling rates. Maybe that bar chart just needs to turn into two piles of trash. And someone's going to come over and be like, what's up with the trash, dude? and, and then you can have a conversation, right? It just opens that door. Um, so I think that it often is an alignment between where you are and what the goals are and who your audience is, back to points you've made a number of times.
Sure. Well, so I think as we're kind of getting to wrapping up, one of the things I found I was doing as I was writing down lots of notes, reading through the book, was you mention and refer to so many different people's work and other books that I feel like my reading list grew a lot. But if you were to say, after someone reads community data, if they're interested in these principles, who are two or three people, books that you would say are your next kind of must reads?
Well, that's a hard question. So I think a couple that are very resonant, certainly data feminism, I've already mentioned, right? Very
Mhm.
practical, raises tons of issues, has been really impactful already. So if you haven't, check it out. The second one, I think, if you want to really like blow up in the toolbox, I think the making with data is a great example to say, like, look, here's cross-modal, um, lots of different examples and some of the motivation why that will just really help you sort of blow open your set of inspirations, which is really helpful to have something like that around. Um,
Mm.
I think that if you want to dig into the alternate histories stuff, I think it's really important to do that. And that's where Lawrence Klein's latest, which now I just was in a talk with her and I forgot the name of it. Do you have it there? Or should I find it?
Oh, I'm finding it. Take me
Okay,
a
great. You'll find it.
second though.
I totally blanked on the name. So I just saw her speak, and the website is amazing. It's an incredibly interactive website that really questions some of our thinking about the history of where sort of our data norms came from.
Mm.
And I get into a little bit of that with some examples in the book. My favorite in there is the boat, the Brooks ship boat, which I sort of didn't know
Yeah.
existed until I was pulling the threads on this, the physical boat. Sculpture. So I think Lauren Klein's latest is another great
I'm
project.
not surfacing it quickly. Can you,
I'll find it.
if you want to dig it, and you'll
Yeah.
find it faster than me. The boat piece, if people aren't familiar with the Brooks boat, you're speaking of the ship for the enslaved people that came over, or different boat. Which boat? Is that the right
Yep,
boat?
it's the classic infographic you've seen. The thing
Yeah.
that most people don't know is that there was Data by Design. That's it. Databydesign.io. Lauren's latest. The boat, like most people don't know, people have seen that infographic. It's talked about a lot as like this open data infographic story that was part of the abolition movement. And it was about the sort of terror and the horror of packing the enslaved people onto this boat. And that it was one of the pieces that led to abolition within the British Empire. But most people don't know, like they made a data sculpture of that boat where you could take off the layers to look at it. And
Oh.
Clarkson brought this to Parliament every year as he tried to get this law passed. And I think that's really interesting. And I want to sort of, I'm looking now, I'm trying to get into like British archives to look for more any other write-ups about this. But I mentioned that in the book and talk about that those histories, we just need to pull some threads, and then you can find these alternate histories that like data sculptures aren't this amazing new thing, right? Like people have been using these techniques for a
Mhm.
while. So I think Lauren Klein's work in Data by Design talks and sort of unpacks that a little bit more. So there's so much good stuff. Those are three that
Uh,
come to mind when you ask that question.
It's funny that just going back to the ship graphic, I think about the space where I remember seeing it on display was at the National Museum of African American History in DC. And part of the experience, going back to pulling, I think, all these pieces of museum and graphics that you've even seen before, but seeing it in a different environment. When you go into that museum, if you haven't been, it's also an exceptional place to visit. If you're in DC, you need the whole day or more for it. But your first thing that you do is go down to the basement and you start in this dark space that as you work your way through history, you move up into progressive amounts of light until you're kind of above ground, in a period during which you're celebrating more culture than some of the history around slavery in the U.S. And so, just thinking about the context within which you see things, I feel like just seeing that graphic in a larger scale and in that dark environment was just a very
Mm,
different experience than seeing it on a digital display on a laptop screen.
yeah,
And
it's
so,
sensory, right? It's about the
it is,
context. Spot
it
on.
is. So I think as we think about kind of closing out today, it's been such a delight to be able to connect with you, talk to you about all these great kind of threads to pull in the community data
Yeah.
world. I hope that this is not the end of opportunities for us to collaborate with you on different ideas. If ever we can do a collaboration with DBS, some kind of data sculpture, Outlier 2025, perhaps. I feel like Alberta would be on board. So
Yeah.
I would love to see how we can make that happen. If folks are interested in following you and finding the book, where can they go ahead and they can find those pieces as they dive in and want to learn more about community data?
Yeah, so I would send you to communitydatabook.com. And you can find links to my online stuff there, links to order the book. Hopefully, something sparked for you all today. If something caught your attention or you're curious, check it out. The Kindle version is available, and you can pre-order from the Oxford website. It's still rolling out globally. The hardcover version, I have like one of the first two copies, and I think you're probably one of the first people to actually read the whole thing, which is amazing. So
I
uh,
appreciated your willingness to find a way to get it to me before this chat because it did
yeah.
really kind of shape the things that I feel like we could go ahead and chat about today and tying this back to the work of data viz creators, right? I think sometimes we see ourselves as a bit distinct from this world of participatory data and community and all those bits. But no matter where you are and what you're doing, even if you're building dashboards for a boardroom, spending time understanding who it is that you're designing for, engaging them as part of the design process, those are all things that are universal concepts that help people engage more with information. And I think we all win when we adapt and we use more of those approaches, not just in art, but also in how we approach telling data stories at work. And so I think that, well, someone might say, well, I'm not doing data history or community participation or making murals. I think there's a lot of principles in your book that can pull through into that world of how we rethink how we work with data, how we talk about data, and how we talk with people outside of work, friends, family, others, about data and information, which I think is a responsibility we all have as data folks, to go ahead and do more of that and be that kind of bridge to information and to understanding complex information in ways that, it's a new frontier for the next 4 years.
Wonderful. It's great to chat. Super fun. Glad, so happy to be hosted and to be in front of this fun community again. And I'm on the
Absolutely.
Slack occasionally, so people
Coming
can
out.
mention me there if you have questions. Yeah.
Well, it's been great to have a chance to connect. I hope that everything with the book launch continues to go well and more hardcover copies make their way around the world. We'll
Yeah.
go ahead and we will sign off for today. Thank you to everyone who joined this live for your great questions, your insights, and we hope that you're taking away some interesting ways to bring these ideas of community data into your work and that you take the time to grab a copy of the book. Have a wonderful rest of your December, and we will hopefully see our DVS members for our annual general meeting in January. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.